The moment this new footage surfaced, everything Erika Kirk had built her public story on collapsed at once. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly. Because this time there was no room for interpretation, no wiggle space, no internet twisting things. This time it wasn't whispers or screenshots passed around in comment sections. It was faces, it was proximity, it was timing. And once you see it, there's no pretending you didn't. For months, maybe longer, people had been fed the same reassurances on repeat. She didn't know him like that. There was no real connection. It's all coincidence. Those explanations worked because they depended on one thing: distance. Distance between names, distance between families, distance between timelines. This footage erased all of that in seconds. Because what it shows isn't speculation. It documents familiarity. And the most unsettling part isn't even that Erika Kirk knew Tyler Robinson. It's that her family did too. Not vaguely, not indirectly, not through some 6 degrees of separation excuse. They knew him, not once, not accidentally, not from a distance. They knew him well enough for comfort to exist without explanation. The clip itself looks harmless at first glance. A casual setting, normal interaction, the kind of moment nobody would ever flag as important until now. But as it plays, the context starts screaming louder than any accusation ever could. The body language, the ease, the lack of hesitation, the way names are used, the way people move around each other like this isn't their first time sharing space. This isn't met once. This isn't heard of him. This is familiar energy. And once the internet realized what it was actually looking at, the entire narrative around Erika Kirk came under a microscope. Every statement she had ever made about distance, awareness, and coincidence suddenly felt unstable. Because if her family had real access, real comfort, then the idea that she herself was completely detached stops making sense. That's when the panic began. People slowed the footage down frame by frame, paused on faces, compared timestamps, dug through old posts that had quietly disappeared months earlier. Suddenly, names that were never supposed to exist in the same timeline were overlapping, and the overlaps were impossible to ignore. And here's the part that made this footage dangerous, not just interesting. Nobody looks surprised. No awkward introductions, no confusion, no wait, how do you know him? Just comfort. Like this connection already existed and never needed explaining. That's when the narrative flipped completely. Because once family familiarity is established, every story built on distance collapses. At that point, people stop asking if they knew. They start asking how much they knew and how long they knew it. The footage spread fast, not because it was dramatic, but because it was calm. And calm is the most dangerous thing a leaked clip can be. Calm means this wasn't a secret moment accidentally caught on camera. Calm means this was normal. And normal is the last thing Erika needed this to look like. Within hours, comment sections stopped debating rumors and started dissecting relationships. Who stood where? Who spoke first? Who wasn't guarded? Who didn't flinch? Fans who once defended Erika aggressively didn't flip sides, they went quiet. Not because they were convinced, but because they ran out of explanations. And Erika, silent, no clarification, no denial. No, this is being misrepresented. Just absence. And absence, when visuals are doing the talking, only makes the footage louder. Because when words and visuals collide, visuals win. Every time. This clip doesn't accuse, it implies. It forces the audience to connect dots on their own. And once people start doing that, the story becomes impossible to control. This isn't about one person knowing another. This is about family proximity, and what that implies about access, awareness, and truth. And if this footage is only the beginning, if more angles exist, if more context surfaces, then this isn't just exposure. It's a rewrite. Because from this moment forward, nobody can honestly say, they didn't know him. The only question left, the one that refuses to go away, is this. What else did they know, and why was it never part of the story to begin with? To understand why this footage detonated the way it did, you have to understand the story that existed before it surfaced, and how carefully that story was constructed. For a long time, Erika Kirk's public narrative rested on a single, stabilizing idea: distance. Distance from controversy, distance from implication, distance from anyone the internet tried to link her to. Every time questions popped up, they were smoothed over with the same framing: coincidence, exaggeration, people reading too much into nothing. And because there was no visual contradiction that framing held, distance is powerful. It puts the burden on critics to prove proximity. But the background here isn't just about Erika as an individual. It's about how narratives are maintained when silence, Selective detail and repetition do the heavy lifting. When you repeat a version of events long enough and nothing visibly challenges it, the audience eventually accepts it as the baseline truth. That's exactly what happened here. The name Tyler Robinson existed on the margins of online chatter for months, maybe longer. It was the kind of name that appeared briefly, disappeared, then resurfaced again without ever becoming central. Every time it did, it was framed as noise, random overlap, coincidence, internet paranoia. And because there was no footage, no undeniable overlap, the conversation never stuck. The background narrative was clean. Erika didn't know him like that. Cleaner still, her family had nothing to do with him. Those two ideas worked together. Even if someone tried to argue proximity, the family angle shut it down. Families imply access. Families imply awareness. Remove the family from the equation and everything becomes easier to dismiss. That's why the family detail matters so much now. Because it wasn't just that Erika was seen near Tyler Robinson. It's that the footage placed her family in the same orbit, comfortably. And that single shift reframed the entire past. When people started revisiting old interviews and statements, they noticed something subtle but important. Erika never outright lied. Her language was careful, technically defensible. Phrases like "I didn't really know him" and "there was no real connection" are elastic. They can stretch to cover a lot of ground, especially if no one challenges them visually. But once the footage surfaced, that elasticity snapped. Suddenly, every carefully chosen word felt selective rather than cautious. Statements that once sounded transparent now sounded edited. Not false, incomplete. And incompleteness is dangerous because it suggests the truth was managed, not misunderstood. The background also reveals why the internet reacted the way it did. This wasn't outrage culture looking for a villain. This was pattern recognition. Viewers weren't accusing Erika of wrongdoing. They were realizing that the story they'd been given relied heavily on the assumption that no one close to her knew Tyler Robinson either. That assumption was never explicitly stated. It didn't need to be. It was implied through omission. And omissions are powerful. When you omit family connections from a narrative, you implicitly tell the audience those connections don't exist or don't matter. But families don't move like strangers. They don't share space casually with people they've never encountered. Comfort takes time. Familiarity takes repetition. Those are facts people intuitively understand, even if they can't articulate them immediately. That's why the footage felt so destabilizing. It didn't introduce a new character. It introduced context, and context rewrites everything that came before it. The background timeline becomes even more uncomfortable when you consider how long this footage might have existed without public attention. The calmness of the interaction suggests it wasn't recorded with awareness that it could ever matter. Nobody in the clip behaves like they're being watched. No guarded movements, no performative distance. That kind of ease only exists when people believe there's nothing to hide, or nothing that will ever be scrutinized. That belief is now gone. The background story also explains why Erika's silence hit so hard. In past situations, smaller ones, clarifications came quickly. Short statements, controlled responses, enough to reset the narrative before it spiraled. This time nothing came, no context, no framing. No attempt to explain why her family appeared comfortable around Tyler Robinson. That absence forced the audience to do something they hadn't done before, fill in the blanks themselves. And once that happens, control is lost. The background isn't about proving intent. It's about showing how the conditions were set for this moment to explode. A narrative built on distance. Reassurances repeated without challenge. A name dismissed often enough that people stopped asking questions until visuals made dismissal impossible. At that point, the story shifted from what happened to what wasn't said. And that shift is irreversible. Because when audiences feel they were given a simplified version of events, rather than a full one, they don't just reassess the current situation. They reassess the past. Every old clip becomes suspicious. Every pause becomes meaningful. Every silence becomes strategic. That's the background weight pressing down on this footage. It's not just a moment caught on camera. It's a contradiction to a long-standing frame. And when frames break, the damage isn't loud, it's structural. From here, the story can only move forward. The background has already been rewritten. The audience no longer accepts the original narrative at face value. Everything now sits under an asterisk before the footage and after the footage. And once a story is divided that way, the next phase isn't about explanation anymore. It's about conflict. Because when visuals collide with words, someone's version of events stops surviving intact. The real conflict didn't explode the moment the footage went public. It ignited when people realized something far more unsettling. This footage wasn't supposed to exist at all, at least not within the story they'd been told for so long. Up until this point, Erika Kirk's narrative had survived on precision. Every response was measured. Every clarification was narrow. Every denial was crafted to answer only the question being asked, never the one behind it. That strategy works when the audience lacks context. It fails the moment context appears on its own, and that's exactly what this footage did. The conflict sharpened when viewers noticed that the clip didn't just show presence, it showed ease. The kind of ease that can't be manufactured on the fly. There was no tension in posture, no careful spacing, no sense of performance. People moved around each other like they already understood the boundaries because they'd learned them over time. That's when the internet stopped asking what it was seeing and started asking why it had never been addressed. The first twist landed quietly, but it hit hard. It wasn't that Erika knew Tyler Robinson. It wasn't even that her family knew him. It was the realization that this level of familiarity had been deliberately left out of the story. That reframed everything. Because if the family connection existed, and now it clearly did, then the earlier framing wasn't just incomplete. It was strategically incomplete. The omissions weren't random, they were structural. They existed to preserve a narrative of distance that the visuals now dismantled. At this point, the conflict stopped being about denial versus proof. It became about credibility. People began revisiting moments that once seemed harmless. Interviews where Erika paused before answering. Times when questions were redirected instead of addressed. Situations where the conversation shifted just as it approached family involvement. None of those moments were incriminating on their own. But together, they formed a pattern that felt intentional. And intention changes how everything is interpreted. The pressure intensified as more eyes turned toward the family members visible in the footage. Not to accuse, but to understand. Who were they? How often were they around Tyler Robinson? What kind of relationship produces that level of comfort without explanation? These weren't tabloid questions. They were logical ones, and logic is harder to dismiss than outrage. That's when the first major consequence surfaced. People who had defended Erika aggressively began qualifying their support, not withdrawing it outright, but softening it. We don't know the full context. There's probably more to this. It's complicated. Those phrases may sound neutral, but they signal a loss of confidence. They indicate that the original narrative no longer feels complete enough to defend unconditionally. The conflict escalated further when analysts started pointing out something subtle but devastating. Erika's previous statements were still technically true, but they no longer felt honest. That's the twist that made this situation so dangerous. Because honesty and truth aren't the same thing in public perception. A statement can be true and still feel misleading if it omits critical context. And once the audience senses that distinction, trust erodes quickly. The silence that followed didn't calm the situation, it sharpened it. No denial arrived. No explanation reframed the footage. No attempt was made to contextualize the family connection. That silence forced the audience to assume one of two things. Either there was no clean explanation that aligned with the old narrative, or acknowledging the truth would introduce new complications worse than the speculation itself. Neither option worked in Erika's favor. The first twist deepened when a few voices, people who claimed proximity to the situation, began floating a new idea, that this footage wasn't a surprise internally, that it had existed for some time, that it was always a potential risk, quietly archived and carefully avoided. According to these whispers, the confidence behind earlier distance narratives wasn't rooted in ignorance, it was rooted in control. Control over what the public saw, control over which connections were acknowledged, control over how much context ever entered the conversation, and control, once exposed, becomes a liability. The conflict reached a new level when viewers noticed that no one in the footage behaved as if they were protecting an image. There was no self-awareness, no hesitation. That absence suggested something chilling. This wasn't a moment anyone thought would ever be scrutinized, which means there were likely other moments just like it, moments that never felt dangerous at the time. That implication alone was enough to destabilize the entire narrative. Because once the audience believes more context exists, even hypothetically, the burden shifts again. Now the question isn't what have we seen, it's what haven't we seen yet. And that's where control is permanently lost. The conflict boxed Erika in completely. If she acknowledged the family connection, she'd have to explain why it was minimized before, and why the public was led to believe distance existed where familiarity clearly didn't. If she dismissed the significance of the footage, she'd be arguing against visual evidence that the audience had already internalized. And if she stayed silent, the audience would continue building conclusions without her input. Every option carried damage. That's why this moment marked the point of no return. The story stopped being about actions and shifted to omissions, and omissions feel intentional in ways actions don't. People forgive mistakes. They struggle to forgive narrative management because it suggests the audience was guided rather than informed. The first twist left the situation suspended in an impossible space. No lie to debunk. No explanation clean enough to reset trust. No way to unsee the footage. Only context and questions that refuse to shrink. And questions don't fade. They multiply. By the end of this phase, the conflict had changed shape. It was no longer a dispute over facts. It was a challenge to credibility itself. The audience didn't need proof of wrongdoing to feel unsettled. They only needed to believe the story they'd been told wasn't the whole one. That belief took hold quickly, and it didn't let go. Because now, people weren't waiting for clarification anymore. They were waiting to see what else would surface. The escalation didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It arrived with pattern recognition, quiet, methodical, and relentless. Once the footage became impossible to dismiss, the internet didn't just react to it. It expanded it. Within hours, the conversation shifted from what the clip showed to what the clip implied. And implication is where narratives collapse, because implication doesn't need certainty. It needs consistency. People began digging, not like conspiracy theorists chasing ghosts, but like archivists revisiting material that had never mattered before. Old videos from events, background clips where faces drifted in and out of frame, casual moments that were never meant to be proof of anything. Except now, they were being watched with a new lens. That lens changed everything. Across different times and locations, the same overlaps appeared. Not dramatically. Not center frame, just enough to register. The same proximity, the same ease, the same lack of guarded behavior. Each moment on its own could be dismissed. Together, they formed something far more unsettling: continuity. And continuity is devastating, because continuity suggests this wasn't an isolated moment that slipped through the cracks. It suggests a routine, a familiarity that existed comfortably outside the spotlight. The shocking reveal wasn't a single explosive clip. It was the realization that the first clip fit too well with everything else people had been told not to worry about. The timeline began to stitch itself together. Viewers compared dates of public statements to dates of appearances. They noticed how certain reassurances lined up just after certain moments. How language shifted subtly over time, from firm denial to softer phrasing, from certainty to ambiguity. None of it proved deception, but all of it suggested management. That's when the story crossed a dangerous threshold. The escalation intensified when a second piece of footage surfaced. It didn't trend the way the first did. It wasn't dramatic. In fact, that's what made it worse. There was no focal interaction, no conversation to analyze, just shared space, casual proximity. The kind that only exists when people don't feel the need to explain themselves. That was the reveal. Because once casual proximity becomes visible across multiple moments, coincidence stops being persuasive. The audience didn't need a smoking gun. They needed coherence. And coherence was exactly what was forming. At this point, the narrative stopped being about Erika Kirk as an individual and became about systems of explanation. About how stories are simplified for public consumption. About what gets left out because it complicates the message. About how distance can be asserted confidently when no visuals exist to contradict it. The escalation also exposed a shift in how people talked about Tyler Robinson. Before, his name existed as an outlier, something to be swatted away with dismissive language. After the footage, his name became contextual, not accusatory, not central, but embedded. That embedding mattered. Because once someone becomes part of the background rather than a rumor, separating them again becomes nearly impossible. Background elements don't disappear, they frame everything else. Industry watchers noticed this shift immediately, not because of scandal, but because of risk modeling. When narratives become unstable, people don't rush to take sides. They wait, they watch, they slow movement, they reassess proximity. None of this is public, none of it trends. But all of it changes outcomes. The shocking reveal wasn't new information, It was new alignment. Alignment between visuals, timelines, and previously dismissed overlaps. That alignment made the silence louder than any denial could have been. Because now, any explanation would need to account for not just one clip, but a growing sense of continuity. And the longer silence persisted, the more the audience concluded that no explanation existed that could preserve the old narrative intact. This is where escalation becomes irreversible. People stopped expecting a statement. They stopped refreshing for clarification. They started assuming the silence was intentional, strategic, chosen. And once silence is perceived as chosen rather than circumstantial, it becomes part of the story itself. The reveal also triggered a subtle but brutal reframing of past defenses. Statements that once felt reasonable now felt narrow. Not false, narrow. And narrow statements feel like answers to the wrong questions when broader context emerges. That's why this moment didn't blow over. It didn't need outrage to survive. It needed fit, and it fit too well. By now, the escalation had reached a point where even neutral observers felt uneasy, not convinced, uneasy. Unease is powerful because it doesn't require belief. It requires possibility. And possibility, once introduced, lingers. The story entered a holding pattern where every new day without clarification reinforced the same idea. The narrative had been incomplete by design. Whether that design was defensive, protective, or simply convenient didn't matter anymore. The effect was the same. The reveal was complete, not because everything was known, but because the audience believed enough was known to question the rest. And when that happens, the story no longer needs new fuel. It sustains itself on interpretation, which sets the stage for the next phase. Because once escalation reaches this level, the pressure shifts outward. It stops being about the person at the center and starts being about reaction. How media frames it, how peers distance themselves, how the industry adjusts quietly. That's when consequences begin to appear, not loudly but permanently. What happened next didn't look like a scandal. It looked like a shift, and shifts are far more dangerous than blow-ups because they don't announce themselves. They settle in quietly and start changing outcomes without asking permission. Once the footage and follow-up overlaps finished circulating, the internet didn't stay loud for long. The outrage phase burned off faster than anyone expected. Hashtags slowed, comment sections cooled, but the story didn't disappear, and that's when it became something else entirely. Because when a story stops trending but refuses to die, it means it has crossed from reaction into assumption. At first, the public response followed a familiar pattern. Hardcore defenders jumped in immediately, arguing that family proximity didn't equal personal involvement. Others pushed back, insisting the footage was being overread. The debate was emotional, chaotic, and loud, but that phase didn't last. Emotion gave way to recalibration. People began changing how they talked about it. Instead of saying, "This is fake," they started saying, "There's probably more context." Instead of saying, "She didn't know him," they said, "It's complicated." That language shift mattered more than any argument. Because fake is a claim you can fight. Complicated is an admission you live with. As the days passed, media commentary followed the same trajectory. No dramatic exposés, no viral takedowns, just careful phrasing. Analysts avoided strong accusations and leaned into words like unfortunate, avoidable, and bad optics. When people whose job depends on precision stop arguing facts and start discussing optics, it signals something important. They're thinking about impact, not truth, and impact reshapes behavior. Behind the scenes, industry conversations reportedly changed tone, not panicked, measured. Advisors didn't tell people to cut ties. They suggested caution, distance. Waiting, in volatile situations, nobody wants to be the first person proven wrong later. So invitations slowed. Group appearances were reconsidered. Collaborations that once felt easy suddenly required timing. Nothing overt. Nothing dramatic, just hesitation. That hesitation is where reputations drift. Fans noticed it immediately. They saw fewer public defenses from people who once spoke loudly. They saw peers who normally rushed to shut down rumors choosing not to engage at all. And they noticed something even more unsettling. No one seemed eager to clear this up definitively. Not Erika. Not anyone close enough to speak with authority. Not anyone with the credibility to reset the narrative cleanly. That absence created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty. Online discussion evolved from argument to analysis. Threads broke down timelines instead of trading insults. Commentators stopped using the word accusation and started using pattern. That change is subtle but lethal. Accusations can be disproven. Patterns once believed are incredibly hard to undo. The industry reaction hardened when people began referencing the footage casually, as if it were already accepted context. That's the moment a story becomes permanent, when it no longer needs introduction. When someone says, "After that footage," and everyone knows exactly what they mean. At that point, it stops being news. It becomes background, and background shapes every future interaction. Silence continued through this phase, and instead of calming the conversation, it allowed it to mature without input from the person at the center. People stopped waiting for clarification and started building expectations around the idea that none was coming. That's a critical threshold, because any response after this point wouldn't be judged against rumor, it would be judged against time past. Why now? Why not earlier? Why after perception has already settled? Those questions are unforgiving. The most telling industry response was neutrality. Not support, not condemnation. Neutrality, the kind that says, "We don't want to be wrong later." Neutrality doesn't protect reputations, it freezes them in place. And freezes can last longer than scandals. By the end of this phase, one thing was undeniable. The footage no longer needed validation to do damage. It had already altered how the story would be discussed going forward. Not in certainties, not in accusations, but in qualifiers. She said this, but after the footage, she claimed distance, but the family connection complicates it. Those buts don't go away. Now the story sits in its most unstable form, not disproven, not confirmed, but absorbed, which is the most dangerous state a narrative can reach. Because once something is absorbed into the background of a public image, the next development doesn't need to be explosive to be decisive. It just needs to exist. The final twist didn't arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a realization, and that realization changed everything. Because at this stage, something became impossible to ignore. This footage didn't disrupt the story, it completed it. Before the footage, Erika Kirk's narrative depended on one fragile assumption. That distance, once asserted, would never be visually challenged. That as long as no one could see proximity, proximity could be denied, minimized, or reframed indefinitely. Words were enough. Silence was enough. That assumption is gone. The twist is this. Nothing else actually needs to come out for the damage to be permanent. No new clips, no whistleblowers, no dramatic confessions. The frame is already set. Once visuals contradict a long-standing narrative, the conversation stops being about truth versus lies and becomes about what the audience now believes is plausible. And plausibility doesn't require proof. It requires coherence. It requires fit. This fit is what sealed the story's fate. Before the footage, Erika's public image rested on clean separations between herself and certain names, between herself and certain timelines, between herself and certain circles. After the footage, those separations didn't disappear, they just stopped feeling believable. Not disproven, not exposed in a legal sense, just reframed. And reframing is permanent. The most unsettling part of this final phase is that nobody had to accuse Erika of wrongdoing. The footage did something far more effective. It introduced reasonable doubt about completeness, about whether the public had ever been given the whole picture, or only the part that felt safest to share. That's why silence mattered so much. If a clean explanation existed, one that aligned family familiarity with prior claims, it would have arrived quickly, calmly, clearly, without drama. The absence of such an explanation didn't prove anything concrete, but it hardened ambiguity into context. And context is what follows people long after headlines fade. From this point forward, every reference to Erika's past statements will carry an invisible footnote. Before the footage, every future appearance will be filtered through that moment, whether it's mentioned or not. That's the quiet consequence of situations like this. They don't explode careers overnight, they reposition them slowly. That's the real twist. The cliffhanger isn't about what Erika will say next, it's about who else might speak. Because stories like this rarely end with the person at the center. They end when someone on the edges, someone with less to lose, fewer incentives to protect a narrative and more memory than strategy, decides to add a detail. Not an accusation, not a bombshell, just a clarification that suddenly feels relevant. And now the conditions for that are set. Once the public accepts that a narrative may have been incomplete, every archived moment becomes fair game. Old footage, old photos, old comments that once meant nothing, not because they prove wrongdoing, but because they might fit into the frame that already exists. And when things fit, they stick. The final twist is that this story doesn't need escalation to survive. It doesn't need trending hashtags or breaking updates. It lives quietly, in how people talk, in how they hesitate, in how they qualify praise instead of giving it freely. This is how reputational shifts actually happen. Not loudly, not dramatically, but incrementally until the before and after are impossible to ignore. As for Tyler Robinson, his role has already changed. Not because of new evidence, but because the footage anchored him somewhere he was never meant to be anchored, inside the family orbit. Once that happens, separation narratives weaken by default. Distance can be claimed, but it no longer feels natural. And now the story waits, not for proof, not for denial, but for time. Time will decide whether this moment fades into internet noise or becomes a permanent reference point. Time will decide whether silence is remembered as restraint or as confirmation that nothing cleaner could be said. That's the cliffhanger. Because even if nothing else ever surfaces, the footage has already done its work. And if something does surface, another angle, another clip, another voice, the frame is already built to receive it. This didn't end the story, it set the terms for how the story will be remembered. And from here on out, every new development won't be judged on its own merits. It will be judged against one quiet, uncomfortable question that never got answered. If they knew him, why was that never part of the story to begin with? That question is still open, and it isn't going away. And now the story is in your hands, because moments like this don't end when the footage stops playing. They end when the audience decides what the silence means and whether it's acceptable. At this point, nobody is asking for drama anymore. They're asking for clarity. And the fact that clarity never arrived is exactly why this moment refuses to fade. Not because anyone was caught, not because there was a smoking gun, but because something that was supposed to be distant suddenly looked uncomfortably close. So let's be real. Do you believe this footage genuinely changes the narrative around Erika Kirk? Or do you think the internet stretched familiarity into something it was never meant to be? Here's the question splitting people down the middle right now. If the family knew Tyler Robinson, should that have been acknowledged from the start? Or does the public have no right to that level of context? Drop your honest opinion in the comments, not the safe answer. Not the polite one, the real one. Does this footage raise fair questions or unfair assumptions? Was silence a smart strategic move, or did it let the narrative spiral out of control? And most importantly, does knowing him automatically mean more than we're being told? Hit like if you think this footage permanently shifted how this story should be viewed. Subscribe if you want updates the moment anything new surfaces, because stories like this don't usually stay quiet forever. We're watching what gets said, we're watching what doesn't, and we're watching how time treats this silence. Because in situations like this, the loudest outcome isn't a statement, it's the way a story slowly becomes accepted context. Stay locked in. This isn't the end of the conversation, it's the moment it became serious. Eyes fire.